Well, welcome to week 9 of our confirmation classes. This final review that we're going to be doing is on the 9th and 10th commandments, which both have to do with coveting. You shall not covet. We're going to be talking about the 9th and 10th commandments in 3 different ways. First, we're going to hear the story of Naboth's vineyard, and how King Ahab and Queen Jezebel showed just how destructive it can be to break this commandment. Second, we'll learn about what it means to be content with what we have and how to make sure our neighbor keeps what is theirs. And finally, we'll learn that the commandment not to covet means that we change the world by recognizing what is enough and how to encourage others to be content too. So the first thing we're going to do is start with this story about Naboth's vineyard, which is one of my favorite stories from the Old Testament. So let's get started. There was once a king of Israel whose name was Ahab. And Ahab was, by the standards of his day, a pretty successful king. He won a lot of battles, he had plenty of chariots and horses, he had a wife who got him an alliance with a neighboring kingdom, and things were going pretty well for him. However, Ahab could be a bit moody when things didn't go his way. He had to deal with this thorn in his side, which was the prophet Elijah. Hopefully y'all have heard of Elijah. And despite being the king, he couldn't do just whatever he wanted. So it was, one day, Ahab was touring his property when he saw this really wonderful vineyard right across the property line. It was beautiful, full of grapevines, lovely sun falling on every row, easy access to his own land. He decided right then and there that he wanted that land. He wanted that vineyard. So he went to the owner's house, a man named Naboth. Now Naboth was a no-nonsense kind of guy. He was stout and hardworking, and he had built up this vineyard from what his father had given him and what his grandfather had given his father. It was the family farm, and he was very, very proud of how well it had turned out. The king had just recently bought a plot of land next to his, which seemed nice enough. Perhaps the king would make a good neighbor. He was about to find out when the king came to his door. After the usual pleasantries of how's the family and that kind of conversation, the king cut to the chase. "I like your vineyard," he said, "and I am willing to trade you a piece of my property in exchange for this vineyard." When he went on, "And if the land won't do, then I have cash, and I can pay you that." Now, Naboth was surprised, even offended by the king's offer. See, in ancient Israel, land you got from your parents wasn't just property that you could buy and sell. Land was a sacred responsibility. It was where your parents had put the labor in to make a life. It was where your grandparents were probably buried. It was more than just land. It was like a family heirloom passed down one generation to the next. Only desperate people who had literally no other options left would even consider selling off their land. So Naboth got angry with the king that he would even make such a suggestion. He flat out refused the king's offer and swore that God would strike him down if he ever sold his family's land. So Ahab got the message and he left. But he wasn't happy about it. In fact, he started thinking about how all the other kings seemed to be able to do whatever they wanted. In Syria and Egypt, kings didn't even have to pay for their subjects' land. They could just take it with a decree. But here Ahab was, totally unable to even buy a single vineyard from one of his own subjects. He wanted that vineyard so bad because he knew it was going to make excellent grapes for an excellent wine. He would grow richer if he just had that land, if he just had that vineyard, if Naboth had just accepted his very generous offer. It upset Ahab so much that he went home, he laid down, and he stared at the wall, not even responding to his servants when they came in to check on him. He didn't say a word, until his wife, Jezebel, came home. Now, Jezebel was a lot of things to the writers in the Bible, not most of them good. She was described as a seductress, a witch, a pagan, an evil woman bent on turning people away from the worship of God. But one thing that was very true about Jezebel was that she was definitely in love with her husband. Jezebel was there for Ahab 110%. So when it came to her finding him in his room, pouting on his bed, Jezebel knew that something was up and had to ask what the problem was. So Ahab explained how Naboth flat out refused to sell him the vineyard, even though Ahab was being completely fair, far fairer than any king in the surrounding countries would be. He should be thankful that the king was even willing to do that much. Well, Jezebel then did what she always did. She fixed the problem. She put a plan in motion to make sure that her husband, her king, would be happy. She wrote a letter using the king's own seal and sent it to the village elders, instructing them to find 2 men who would be willing to accuse Naboth of blasphemy, which was a crime punishable by death. She needed 2 men because in Jewish law, you needed 2 witnesses. The elders followed what they thought were the king's instructions, and they got a couple of ne'er-do-wells to accuse Naboth of blasphemy, and after a quick trial, had him taken out and stoned to death. Then they sent word back to the palace. Well, Jezebel came back to find Ahab still pouting, and told him to sit up straight, be happy, and go claim the now former Naboth's vineyard for himself. Ahab was so happy that he got up, washed his face, and immediately ran down to Naboth's vineyard and declared it his. He was the king, after all, and this former owner was a blasphemer, a criminal. Ahab got what he wanted, even if it cost Naboth his reputation and his life. Now, tonight we're going to be talking about the 9th and 10th commandments. They have some small differences, but it's mostly on the same thing, but with different emphasis. The lesson is the same between the 2 of them. Don't covet what is not yours. Now, what does it mean to covet? To covet means to want something badly enough that it causes problems. Problems for you, problems for other people, and especially for problems with your interactions with others. Coveting something is more than just wanting it. It's wanting something so much that you will break rules or hurt people to get it. It's like jealousy on steroids. It's like a dangerous level of wanting. It's the obsessive end of wanting. These commandments tell us that coveting is dangerous, and God wants us to train ourselves not to covet. The best place to start in order to follow this commandment is to be able to recognize the difference between a want and a need. Needs are things that everyone should have, the kind of stuff that keeps us alive and sane. There are all kinds of examples of needs: food, shelter, clothing, those kinds of things. They're things that if we didn't have them, it would be more than just annoying, because we would need access to them. Wants, on the other hand, are just things that we desire that we think will make us happier if we have them. You need food, but you don't need dessert. You need shelter, but you don't need a marble mansion with an indoor pool. You need connection with other people, but you don't need 24-hour access to your social media account. When we blur the line between wants and needs, it becomes really hard to follow this commandment, because coveting always involves things that we want, not things that we need. Ahab did not need the vineyard that he took from Naboth. He just wanted it. And when we think that things that we want are actually things that we need, we become much more willing to do bad things to the people who get in the way of us getting that thing. But of course, this commandment isn't just about being content with what we have and not coveting others' stuff. It's also about helping our neighbors be content with what they have. Now, Martin Luther was a bit too specific to his 16th century context in his explanation, so I'm going to paraphrase him here. Essentially, he described the 9th and 10th commandments as saying that we are to fear and love God so that we will be content with what we have, and we will help our neighbor keep what they have and be content with it. We're called to train ourselves and our neighbors to be content with what we have, to be happy with what we have, to recognize the difference between a want and a need, and in the process, make sure that each person is able to keep the things that are theirs. Being content is the opposite of coveting. When you are content, it means that you recognize that you have what you need. And while you might want things, that's natural, you're not going to prioritize what you want over what your neighbor needs. The thing is, God does give enough for everyone to have enough, as long as we make sure that everyone gets what they need. When we covet, we end up taking what someone else needs. But if we are content, we will be able to share because we'll know that we have more than enough already. So how does this affect the real world? Let's talk about that. Think about commercials. Commercials are a multi-billion-dollar industry. They're these whole groups of people whose whole job is to figure out ways to make people want the thing that their company is selling. And companies will pay big bucks to advertise in places that will get them more people to see their product and want their product. Just look at the ads for the Super Bowl and how much they pay for those. But the bedrock of advertising is to convince you that you need what they are selling. When almost every time, it's just something you might want. Commercials are temptations to break the 9th and 10th commandments. But it's not just that. When we get bombarded with commercials showing happy, beautiful people who are only happy and beautiful because they bought that product, it makes us start to believe that we need that product too. A lot of the things in the world try to make us believe that if we have the right thing, then we will be happy. And a big problem with that is that no one thing will ever make us happy, ultimately. I mean, an entire carton of Oreos will make you happy for the moment, but not for much longer than that. The things that you want, any of the things that you want, might make you a little happier for a little while, but they won't make you happy in the end. It's because the world is working to confuse our wants and our needs. So our calling as Christians, in following the 9th and 10th commandments, is to train ourselves to be content, and to help others learn to be content too. Being content with what you have and leading others to do the same will change the world. If we all realized that we only need what we actually need and not what we want, then we'd realize just how abundantly God has provided for everyone. And if we learn to be content with what we have, we'll also find that we're much more capable of being generous with our neighbors, because we will know that we have so much more than we need. Imagine if the world recognized that. Imagine if everyone who had more than they needed realized and they could be content and they shared their excess with those with less. Everyone would have enough. And if people learned to be content with what they had when they had enough, then no one would feel the need to take from anyone else. We wouldn't be jealous of what our neighbor has because we know that we have what we need and we're good. Being content with what we have frees us to do what God calls on us to do, to be generous with our neighbors. So to review, tonight we talked about the 9th and 10th commandments, that we should not covet. And we covered the 9th and 10th commandments in 3 ways. First, We heard the story of Naboth's vineyard, and how King Ahab and Queen Jezebel showed just how destructive it can be to break this commandment. Second, we learned about what it means to be content with what we have, and how to make sure our neighbor keeps what is theirs. And third, we learned that the commandment not to covet means that we change the world by recognizing what is enough, and how to encourage others to be content too. And that is the 9th and 10th commandments.